Okay, context. My name is Brian Tang, and late last year I had this opportunity to have a general meeting with Lucasfilms. Now, this kind of came out of the blue at the time, but I had been planning to do a proof of concept for a pod racing idea I had for a while. However, this meeting was 3 weeks out. Not a lot of time to produce and edit a fan film. But I figured, when's the next time I'm going to have this FaceTime with Lucasfilms? So I decided now or never. We spent a week in pre-production. We shot for 1 day on a volume stage, and 2 weeks of me kind of burning the midnight oil in Blender 3D to complete the VFX in time. Some really great people came together to make this happen, and this video is broken up into two parts. The first is the actual shoot, and the second is where we'll dive into the Blender 3D stuff. So I hope you enjoy this behind-the-scenes look at this really quick and dirty pod racing trailer that we put together last year.
Oh my gosh, this is so cool. You can just imagine my
Current
expression.
state of affairs.
You have no idea how amazing this is.
Thank you. Well, jump on in. Come on.
Oh yeah, oh my gosh.
Alan Stubbs, our production designer, built this incredible pod racer cockpit in less than a week from scratch.
Just don't put pressure on that. On this, just because it's it's a leverage point. You can release them here so that they can also rotate.
Whoa, they rotate this way?
Yeah, pitches and yaws.
Yeah.
On the day of the shoot, we brought the cockpit over to the volume stage and we started lighting, while the folks at Cinepax Burbank were queuing up the environments on the volume wall. We had an incredible makeup artist team, Alex and Vanessa, as well as a fantastic costume designer, Kaylin, who cobbled together an insane amount of Star Wars appropriate wardrobe in less than 2 days.
Oh my god.
Because of our limited pre-production window, Josh and his team were literally building the Unreal environments on the day between takes. We shot on the Alexa Mini with Zelmuse Apollo Anamorphics. Joseph, our DP, was able to light both the physical set as well as the virtual set in order to blend the two worlds together seamlessly. I think this project was a perfect use case for a small volume stage like this, where being able to have a multitude of exotic location changes in a single day was essential in making this project happen.
All right, ready, Justin. 3, 2, 1, action.
But having physical production design on set was equally important, tying everything together. It allows for certain things to fall into focus, for actors to be able to reach out and touch things, and ultimately make the world a more realistic and tactile place. Alright, so here's what it looked like when I was kit bashing the Hero Pod Racer together. This was almost entirely made up of photoscan elements from Ian Hubert's Patreon. I used to be a massive fan of the Star Wars Incredible Cross-Sections books, where they broke down how the ships in Star Wars worked. I really wanted to design the pod to have an easily recognizable silhouette, but also try to justify every design choice to have some sort of vague engineering logic to it. Animating a pod racer turned out to be one of the hardest things I've had to do, since technically it's 3 independent floating objects moving as one. In the end, I parented everything to an empty, and each independent object had a series of slightly offset noise modifiers. That way, I could keyframe the broad stroke movements and still retain that floaty, randomized look. The ropes holding the pods to the engines had to be simulated and pinned. That took some time to adjust the tension and bounce in order to make sure that the engines looked like they were pulling the pod along. So this is how I did the hangar fire shot. After some kit bashing, I used a flame video element from actionvfx.com, and I placed it in 3D space. Then I made the video itself an emissive texture that would light the 3D space dynamically. This way, I can get the reflections of the flames in the ground and the edges of the doorway and on the boxes to the left. For this shot of the stands, I blocked out the camera move first to make sure I didn't build more than I needed to for the shot. This was extremely helpful because the crowd simulation plugin that I was using slowed my computer down significantly, so not having to compute anything that wasn't in frame was extremely important for having a reasonable render time. The actual 3D models for the individual spectators were not very good looking, so I kept the focus on the main guy here, who was a guy I downloaded off of Mixamo. I don't like 2D tracking my lens flares, so I'll usually export an emission pass in addition to my main render, which is only going to display emissive elements in your scene. That way, when I'm compositing, I can tell optical flares to reference the emission pass to tell it where the lens flares should go. The method I use to execute the crash shots are mostly from a tutorial from Ian Hubert's Patreon. In general, the idea is that you block out the large elements with what I'd call proxy objects. These simple objects are what you're running the physics simulation on, rather than any high poly objects that would slow your computer down. With the proxy objects, I can audition little differences like placement, friction, bounce, in order to get something I generally like. Then you would parent the high detailed objects to the proxy objects. With some keyframed shape keys and some proportional editing, you can animate your object to crunch and deform as it tumbles. What's important to understand is these objects will represent the large chunks of debris. Once you bake the physics simulation into keyframes, you can then do a secondary, more detailed simulation of smaller pieces of debris. I was trying really hard to avoid having to simulate any smoke, so I ended up using video card elements from actionvfx.com again. This generally works as long as you make sure the video card is facing the CG camera at all times. I wanted to showcase some variety in the Podracers, so I kit bashed a few more elements from Big, Medium, Small. I, again, really didn't want to do any smoke simulation, so I downloaded an animated VBD from thepixellab.net. They had exactly what I was looking for. In this case, it was really important to me that it was an actual volumetric cloud simulation because the camera was arcing around it and I wanted to see the perspective changing. The rope cutting shot was a lot of trial and error, mostly me banging my head against the wall trying to make the rope simulation cooperate. The general idea was I used a proxy object to push the two ropes off to the side for a moment while the wind force field I had in front of the engines were blowing the ropes backwards the whole time. Once I got the ropes to marginally cooperate, I hand animated the actual pod racer that was doing the cutting, and the pod that disconnects from its engines. To get the random spread of credits, I did a physics sim and locked them in their last resting position. For this scene, I wanted to really quickly visually communicate that there are people who, if the price is right, might try to take out the competition. This is sort of reminiscent of the Tusken Raiders who were shooting at Anakin during the race in episode 1. Here's another example of how using a video card in 3D space is super effective, especially when you want to emit light back into the 3D environment, like this fiery explosion. The most important thing about making this technique work is matching the aesthetic qualities of the footage you're working with, like matching the shutter speed or eyeballing the focal length that would justify what would be falling in or out of focus. Lastly, I animated a camera jolt from the shockwave of the explosion, which I think really added a real tangible sense of realism to the shot. It's worth noting that I animated the ground plane to move instead of the objects. So essentially, the objects are just dropping onto a moving conveyor belt of sorts. For one of the most complex crash shots, I really wanted to have a pole split one of the engines down the middle. For this, I needed to make an arrangement of proxy objects in the general shape of the engine and run the simulation a few times until I got a result that I liked. The ground plane is bumpy in order to make sure that the objects would tumble when they hit the ground. I also played a lot with friction and bounce settings here as well. Making the proxy objects look like they were collapsing in on each other was just a lot of trial and error with the shape of the objects and the placement of the size of the pole. Now with the proxy objects baked to keyframes, I now break the high poly object up into separate pieces and parent them to the proxy objects. Now I'm running a secondary, more detailed simulation for the smaller pieces of debris. Eventually I'll animate a couple pieces of debris to guide the eye in the chaos of the shot, like this turbine that comes spinning out in front of everything. As per usual, I was doing my best to avoid having to do my own smoke simulations, so I downloaded another VBD from thepixellab.net and used it to supplement the video cards of dirt explosions that were placed whenever one of the big chunks of debris hit the ground. For the scene on Coruscant, I was hoping to get a really big wide shot of the space. However, we were limited by the size of the volume wall. What you see here is the widest we could get before seeing off the wall. So in post, I ended up figuring something out. Alright, so this is the original footage, and this is the generative fill result. It's not great, but I can cover that up with 3D plants and vases. So I'm projecting the footage, or the generative fill result, onto a 3D piece of geometry, and it all looks perspectively correct from the camera's point of view. I'm also able to implement a small camera move into this that didn't exist in the original footage. Shout out to Kai Patterson for helping me do the hologram effect here. The wide of the stands actually took the longest because my computer couldn't handle the crowd simulation of this scale all at once. So I did separate renders breaking up the stands so that my computer only needed to render a section at a time. In hindsight, I probably could have gotten away with something that was less detailed, but in the end I'm really proud of the scale of this shot. For the pit droid shot, I really wanted to try out Rococo's video motion capture tool. The idea is that I should be able to act out my scene and apply the resulting animation to my 3D character. After a weirdly long calibration process, I gave it a shot and the results were not great. Honestly, in hindsight, it's so obvious that it accidentally took my torso and my friend's legs and combined them together into whatever this was. So I ended up hand animating the pit droid's thumbs up movements. I don't consider myself an actual animator, much less a rigger, so I honestly am really proud of this shot because I was just sort of winging it. Coming from a cinematography background, I tend to want to light things in CG as if it was real life. Where's my key light? How do I separate my subject from my background? Do I want to use a backlight? How much fill do I need? Also, how can I make the background more interesting and have texture without taking away from the subject? For the title card, I was inspired by the Andor Season 1 trailer. It's pretty basic, so I'll let this time-lapse play out as I wrap things up here by telling you about how the meeting went with Lucasfilms. First off, it was already surreal enough of an experience to walk into the Lucasfilms office. As you can imagine, there's a lot of Star Wars and Indiana Jones memorabilia everywhere. Their boardroom has an area with 2 stormtroopers at the head of the table, and they were super nice and wonderful people to chat to. They enjoyed the trailer. They wanted to see more. I think the fact that I had shot this 3 weeks prior to the meeting was actually a major talking point. I had not quite finished the crash shots at that point, so it was still a work in progress, but it was close enough to making a good impression. As for expectations versus reality, this was honestly the best case scenario. Make a good impression, be on their radar for the future, continue to make things like Podracer to showcase what I'm personally interested in making. Thanks so much for sticking around to the end. Let me know if you want to see more of these behind the scenes breakdowns. I intend to do something very similar for my short film Kodama. Until then, I'll see you on the next one.